Welcome to Bentech SM's sheet metal design software video demonstration. In this video we're going to show an example of laying out a sheet metal design using Bentech SM. As you will see, Bentech SM is designed to be very easy to use. We're going to start out by laying out our base flange. We will first select a couple points to make this flange. We also need to create our points on the y-axis. And then we can take these 4 points and combine them with lines defining our base flange. Once we've got the outline of our base flange, we need to define it in our system. We'll use the Sheet Bends tab, the definition button, selecting our plate material, and defining the flange. At this point we can also add some bends. We're going to add a couple bends using a 90-degree bend angle. They're going to be 5 inches in height. We want them to go in the up direction, and we're going to use our 0.3 radius that we created in our material library. We then need to select which line we want the bend to be added to. We will first select our left-hand line. We will need to name that flange. Pressing OK, it will now move that to the left flange. Then we can do the same thing to add our right flange using the same parameters. Click on the far right line of our base flange. It asks for a name once again, and then sets that flange. All those flanges are now defined, and we can use our shaded display to view what we've created so far. Each one of these flanges will have a couple of cutouts in them, so we're going to define those now. We'll start out by selecting our base flange from our flange drop-down list. Once that is selected, we can start to add our features. We first need to start by adding a couple of points. Our first point is going to be used using the incremental version, and it is going to be 3 inches in the X field. We're going to add 3 inches in the Y field, and we're going to create a point in that location on the base flange. Then we can go ahead and create a circle on that point. We're going to use a square hole in this case with a 2-inch width. Selecting our last point we created, we can now place that hole. We're also going to create a cutout in this flange. For this, we need to select a couple points for that cutout. Since we created a cutout in the center of our square, we can use that to create our points for our cutout. Moving to point once again, our first point is going to be 2 inches from the center point of our square. Hitting that in our incremental fields, we can place that on our last point. Our next point is going to be 1 inch below this point we just created. We will select our new point based on our last point. We will then need to create a new point 2 inches from this new point, and then one more point 3 inches above the last point. We can now connect all these lines using our 2 points of continuous method. That will create our square hole and our cutout. One feature we want to add to our cutout is going to be a fillet in the bottom right hand corner. To create this, we will select the arc button, the fillet method, auto trimming the lines. We want to make that a 1/2 inch radius. We're going to select the first line we want to fillet, and then the second line, and as you can see, it automatically trims those lines based on our parameters. Once we have both of those holes created, we need to redefine that flange. We'll do by hitting the Sheet Bends tab, the definition button, back to plate, and define the flange. We can now create our end flanges. We're first going to select our left flange to start out. Once we have that selected, we need to place a hole to create our hole feature. So we will select point, hit our entity center. We're going to use that to define our first point in this flange. We'll select that point, and then our hole is going to be 2 inches to the right of that point. selecting the point we created on Entity Center, we can now place that point. We can then fill in that with a hole. I'm going to use a 2-inch diameter, placing on that point. Once that hole is created, we can define it, and that flange is now created. We're now going to move over to our right flange, and we're going to select a rectangular hole in that flange. So we need to start out by creating a point. We're going to select the far right corner and drop on our new point. We can then create a hole. We want to use a rectangular hole for this one. So we're going to use a 2-inch width, and we're going to drop that hole right where we created that last point. We again need to define that flange, and then we can see our completed project in our 3D display. Last thing we can do with this is we can create some dimensions. We'll go up to Create. We will hit the Dimension button. It gives us several options creating these dimensions. We're going to start out by doing some horizontal. First, we need to select a couple points that we want to create a dimension from, and then you'll bring up the text, and we can place that text wherever you like. We can also do a vertical dimension by selecting points again, and then moving the text. We can also do linear dimensions by hitting the Linear tab, selecting on our 2 points, and then creating a dimension that way. So as you go through, you can define each of the dimensions that you need to create your project.